All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy Ebersol, and I am very privileged to be the director of the Milwaukee Preservation Alliance and to welcome you this afternoon to our first webinar of the year, which we are so excited to be hosting. This is our Preservation Month webinar as well. May is a special month set aside to call attention to the value of the places that make our communities special and the work being done by people all over the community and the country to make sure that those places survive and the stories that they embody survive with them. So we're very excited to have you here with us for Preservation Month for Latinx Milwaukee and historic preservation. We're very excited to welcome Marquette University Latinx Studies Professor, Dr. Sergio González, to give our presentation this evening and talk to us a bit about the places in Milwaukee that are important to our city's large and vibrant Latinx community and how we might be able to honor and protect those places, whether that's through traditional or different newer tools of preservation. As we'll hear a little bit later, there was a story on Bubbler Talk on WUWM last year that kind of raised this question about sites, historic sites designated for the importance of the Latinx community that was posed to us at MPA last year, and we had to say there are none in the city, and so we are. That is an unfortunate thing. So we are happy to be bringing this conversation to continue that conversation and bring it to a continued growing audience. And I think this is, it's really exciting to me because I think this is really where the preservation movement is headed, telling the full story, not just focusing on buildings or buildings of importance to certain populations, but telling much fuller stories and really diving into cultural significance and cultural heritage. So this conversation today is a step in that direction towards creating a more inclusive preservation movement here in Milwaukee and nationwide. So we're really hoping that this is, again, not the end of the conversation, but a step as we continue to make our preservation work more inclusive. So a couple quick housekeeping things before we get started. Again, first, as I mentioned earlier, please mute and turn your video off if you are not speaking. That will just help to make sure everybody is able to pay attention to our speaker. As you heard probably a few minutes ago, we are recording the video this evening. It will be available on our website for any and all by next week, hopefully. So we'll send out an email with those details, but encourage you to share and watch again and share this with others. We want this to be a resource going forward. Quick information on the timeline. I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes here at the beginning, and then we will get into the reason that you're all here. Dr. González will talk to us for 30 to 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions. So do encourage you as we're going through the presentation to use that chat button and put your questions in the chat. At the end, then I will present those questions to Dr. González, and we will be able to continue the conversation that way, and hope to wrap up around 6:30. So again, feel free to use that chat to ask questions or just to talk and comment as we're moving forward as well. Real briefly about our organization, I want to first thank all of our members and followers who are in attendance tonight for your support. Again, you are the reason that we exist, the reason we're able to bring this program to the community for free. So appreciate everyone's support, and welcome to all those in attendance who may be new to the Milwaukee Preservation Alliance. We're so glad that you're here with us this afternoon. MPA is Milwaukee's preservation advocacy nonprofit, and we exist essentially to make preservation mainstream in Milwaukee. And we have our mission and our vision here on the screen, essentially to promote the stewardship and awareness of our city's historic, cultural, and economic value. And we hope to make preservation mainstream by demonstrating to the community the link between historic preservation and viable economic development. And I would add to that sustainability, cultural heritage, and a number of other factors as well. The way that we do that as an organization is through our advocacy efforts, some of which include our work at the Soldiers' Home, which we have been active in for over a decade. These buildings were recently restored, many of them after 30 years of vacancy as housing for veterans and their families at risk of homelessness. And we were proud to receive an award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, along with the many partners who in the project received the award. And so us and many other partners were critical to that amazing success. And we're currently working there at the Soldiers' Home to encourage the redevelopment of the chapel and theater and governor's mansion on the grounds, and return them to service to veterans as well. And we are offering tours newly, and we'll more about that briefly on the next slide. Also been very active with the Mitchell Park domes. Had those the domes listed on the National Trust's 11 most endangered list a number of years ago, and are continuing to work with the community to make sure that the community is able to have their voice heard in future decisions about the domes, and working with decision makers to make sure that they understand the importance of the domes to the community and how they can be preserved. And I'll just mention briefly, mark on your calendar, June 14th at 9 a.m. There is an update that will be provided to the county on a report that is looking into possible solutions going forward at the domes. So make sure that you are on our email list for more details on that. And we also serve as a support for other advocacy efforts, including the Columbia Hospital on UWM's campus. We're active in advocating for the Puddlers Cottages preservation in Bayview, the Forest Home Library. Last year, advocated for using ARPA funds to restore housing as a way to sustain affordable housing in the community, and much more. So we are here behind the scenes, in many cases, as a resource to folks to understand how these preservation projects are possible. We have a number of cool events coming up. I mentioned Soldiers' Home. We have tours that are happening twice a month through the summer to take in this fabulous site, the most significant VA campus in the nation. And we have a walking tour app there that's free as well. All of this is free, and that just relaunched as well. So you see the link there to register for that. We have a happy hour to celebrate the end of Preservation Month next Wednesday evening. You'll see the link there to register on our website, and that's just a casual time for us to all get together and chat about preservation and the places that matter to us. And then a book talk coming up later in June called Architects of an American Landscape as part of the celebration of Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape designer who is very active in Milwaukee. This is his 200th birthday this year. And we're going to also, not on the screen, but I'll mention briefly, we're partnering with the Association for Preservation Technology on a cool program on documenting historic buildings on September 15th and 16th as well. So again, encourage you as you enjoy the program this evening to please stay in touch, because we are a membership organization. We do depend on your support to continue to do this work. So I encourage you to become a member or sponsor our programs or our work if you are a corporation or have access there. And please do sign up for our email list, follow us on social media. I'll mention as well, we have a little pitch in the bottom. We have the old marquee letters from the former Warner Theater on Wisconsin Avenue that's now the Bradley Symphony Center. And these we are selling as a fundraiser for the organization. So it's a fun way to put "eat" in your kitchen or get your initials or any kind of other fun thing you might like to spell. So check out our website for those details. So finally, as we're jumping into the important part of the evening, well, and I shouldn't say this is a critical piece as well. We always like to acknowledge that in the work that we're doing in preserving places here in Milwaukee, that we are not the owners of these places or the traditional stewards of them. And so we always read a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our programs. And so in that vein, we acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. And with that, just an introduction to our fabulous speaker this evening, Dr. Sergio González. Dr. González is an assistant professor of Latinx studies in the departments of history and languages, literatures, and cultures at Marquette University. As a historian of 20th century US immigration, labor, and religion, his scholarship focuses on the development of Latinx communities in the US Midwest. His first book, Mexicans in Wisconsin, offers a concise introductory history of Mexican settlement and community formation across the state. His current project, called Strangers No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th Century Wisconsin, explores the relationship between Latinx communities, religion, and social justice movements across the state. Dr. González has bridged his academic scholarship to broader audiences by serving on the State Wisconsin Historic Preservation Review Board and the boards of directors of Voces de la Frontera, the Wisconsin Labor History Society, and the Wisconsin Latinx History Collective. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. González. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate that. And let me, as I do that awkward move over to sharing my screen. Oops, hopefully, let me get the right screen going. It's a good start. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a topic that is very much near and dear to my heart, which is the history of our city's Latinx populations, and specifically to find a way to connect the missions of so many different public historians here in Milwaukee and this organization, the Milwaukee Preservation Alliance. I was looking at the attendees list, and it was nice to see so many friends that are here, but also a bunch of new faces that I've never met before. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this space with you all here tonight. As Jeremy mentioned, this conversation comes out of previous conversations that he and I had, although we were not having them together. We were having them through the medium of Bubbler Talk, through WUWM's local station here, when last year Angelina Mosher-Salazar reached out to a few people here in the community and asked, which is an important question, which is, where are all of the historically designated landmarks that recognize the history of Latinos, Latinx, and Hispanic people in Milwaukee and Wisconsin? And as Jeremy mentioned in his opening remarks, unfortunately, the reality is that there are actually no locations, there are no physical spaces in the city of Milwaukee, nor across the state of Wisconsin that are currently on either the state register or the national register. It's actually one of the reasons why in 2019, I accepted the nomination to join the Wisconsin State Historic Preservation Review Board to try to come to understand what the process was by which buildings are added to these registries, and then hopefully one day serve as a resource for the community that I call home here in Milwaukee and across the state, so that we can start to rectify the situation. What I want to do today is two different things. One is to run through a very brief, I wouldn't call it concise, but it will be kind of a whirlwind history of our state's Latino, or of our city's Latinx, Hispanic populations. And I want to preface by saying that there's no way within the 35 minutes I've been allotted that I can cover this history. In fact, it's a history that I cover in the first book I wrote, and a history that I'm covering in the second book that I'm writing, and I could write more and more books about this community. And so this is merely an introductory conversation, and that will lead me to the second point that I hope we can do today, which is to engage in this conversation and to talk a little bit about what this history means for the goal of historic preservation in Milwaukee and across the state of Wisconsin. I want to start with a little bit of an origin story. I always like to begin with positionality and to talk about how I come to this subject. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm a professor at Marquette University, but of course, to become a professor, you have to go through graduate school. And when I was beginning my graduate work in the history department at UW-Madison in 2012, I had to make the decision on what it was that I wanted to focus on, what it was that I wanted to study. And the reality was that when I was growing up and when I was entering graduate school, conversations about Hispanic population, Latino populations, Latinx populations in the United States often focused on this space, this physical space, not just the US-Mexico borderlands, but specifically the US-Mexico wall. And of course, in our previous administration, it was a physical space that predominated overwhelmingly our conversations about migration, about immigration, about refugees, about asylum seekers, and really about the full experience of Latinos and Latinx people in this country. But the reality, of course, is that this is not at all representative of what it means to come to this country, to find a place in this country, to consider yourself Latinx in the United States. And I don't think that's the case for most people who are of Latinx descent in this country. It certainly wasn't the case for me. Both of my parents are originally from Jalisco, Mexico. They came to Milwaukee at different times in the 20th century. My dad's family in the 1960s and the 1980s. I was born here in Milwaukee. I'm a Wisconsin lifer, and I've never even been to the US-Mexico border wall. And so when our national conversations predominated on this physical space, I often found the histories and the stories of my family, of my community completely lost or ignored within these spaces. And so I decided when I went to graduate school that I wanted to focus my research on the history of the place that I call home, which is here in Wisconsin. I wanted to understand why it was that hundreds of thousands of people of Latinx descent from all across Latin America and from the US Southwest have made the decision across the 20th century to come to Wisconsin and settle in the state, and have found a way to make it their home. So by way of origin story, my first archival trip to begin digging into these histories was the Milwaukee County Historical Society, which is on Old Third World Street. And I remember the day very well. It was a beautiful summer day in the summer of 2013. I was just finished my first year of graduate school as a master's student, and I was doe-eyed and bushy-tailed, very excited about the opportunity to dig into the stacks and begin to actually start to think about these spaces. You know, what does it mean to be Latinx in Wisconsin? I had the vision of writing the definitive history of labor and of unions for Latinos and Latinx people here in Wisconsin. And I went to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, and I remember my first trip there. I said to the archivist, I'd like to see everything that you've preserved on this community. And I waited a few moments. The archivist came back with a few boxes, and he said, this is it. This is everything we have. Literally just a handful of boxes was everything that the Milwaukee County Historical Society had preserved over its century-long history on this community. So I was pretty beat up. I was pretty down on my first trip because I thought there's no way I can write a dissertation, much less a definitive history of my community if this is all that's been preserved. After I got over that initial shock, I opened the first box, and the absolute first thing that I pulled out of the archival stacks was this document that you see here. And I want to tell you that I was very surprised to pull this document out, because what you see here is not only a piece of archival evidence, it's actually a picture of me in my parents' arms on a beautiful summer day in 1987. I'm just a few months old. I was born April 30th. So here I'm just a few months old. And so literally on my first trip to the archives, my first kind of stab at trying to understand the history of Latinos in Wisconsin, I literally found myself within my research. And after I got over that initial shock, I looked at this image and I started to ask myself, what does it mean that the Milwaukee Journal magazine, which was an insert for the Milwaukee Journal in the 1980s, has deemed the pulse of Hispanic Milwaukee, the beating heart of Hispanic Milwaukee, to be this image right here. This is what represents our city's growing Hispanic Latino population during this period. And I got to thinking, what does it mean that that image includes not just me and my parents, but smiling families leaving this space? And I knew immediately what this space was. This is the front steps of Our Lady of Guadalupe Holy Trinity Church off of 3rd and National, right in the heart of Milwaukee's Latinx community. What does it mean that this is where people build their sense of belonging in Milwaukee and across Wisconsin? And it completely reset the way I was thinking about this history. My first archival trip, I began to focus specifically on religious spaces as places where Latinx people have come across the 20th century to build a sense of community, where at times they have faced inhospitable relationships at the work site, in the city streets. They faced prejudice, racism, discrimination. It has often been to these religious spaces where they have found not just a space of safe harbor, but in fact, a place where they can armor themselves and build social movements to redefine what it means to live a dignified life in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. And so across my minute presentation I'm gonna give for you today, you're gonna see churches and religious spaces pop up periodically because I think they are foundational spaces, not just as physical spaces, but as something a little bit deeper. As someone I interviewed in my research on the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, this individual reminded me that churches are not physical spaces. Churches are much more than that. They're, of course, the communities that people build. Before I jump into this history, I just want to quickly do a bit of a content check on our audience for today. And for those of you that perhaps have seen my talk before or have read my first book, Mexicans in Wisconsin, this will be a gimme. This will be an easy one, but perhaps not. So the first question I have for us, the only question I have for us to think about before we jump into our conversation, when did the first Latino immigrants settle in Wisconsin? All right, so you can drop your guess in the link or in the chat, or you can whisper it to somebody sitting next to you. 4 options here: 1848, 1884, 1920, and 1945. And I'll open up the chat to see if anybody's brave enough to throw their options. Thank you, Susan. 1884. There we go. Jeremy guesses B. Sally says 1920. All right. I guess we're kind of shy in the chat today. That's all right. Oh, there we go. There we go. Don't be shy. We're what, 2 years into the pandemic? We all know how to use Zoom. All right. Well, we're getting some good guesses here. The answer is actually 1884. I picked some important dates here. 1848, of course, founding the state. 1920, an important day for immigration history. We'll get to that in a little bit. 1945, after the World War II period. But the actual answer here is 1884. And this is a man that you see here in front of you, Rafael Valles. Rafael Valles was originally from Puebla, Mexico. He was a classically trained musician, a bit of a child prodigy living in Puebla, Mexico, which is not too far from the capital of Mexico. And he was actually in music school in the capital of Mexico in the 1880s. And an American opera company was doing a tour of Mexico during that time. It was something that opera companies did during the 19th century. And often when they were doing tours of foreign places, they would ask local artists to play along with them. Rafael Valles played with them, and they hired him after their tour ended in Mexico, and they brought him back to the United States. And for some reason that I have yet to ever be able to determine, he decided to settle after his contract with this opera company ended here in Milwaukee. And he became Wisconsin's first documented person of Latino, Latinx, Hispanic descent. That's certainly not to say that he is the first that we know of, the first ever, but he's the first that we've ever been able to historically record. And Rafael Valles really made a life for himself in Wisconsin. He became the organist and choir director for some of the city's most important churches and synagogues. He became involved in local politics. He became a composer. There you see a piece that he wrote called La Fidelita. Importantly for me, he became Marquette University's first Latinx professor. He was a professor of music at the turn of the century. And he really made a life for himself. And the reason I point out Rafael Valles is not just to put an image of a man with a beautiful mustache on your screen, although that's an important point. It's also to kind of plant the flag and for us to begin to understand the length of this history. This is not a recent history that we're going to be talking about today. Rafael Valles was a sojourner. He was kind of an individual who came in the 1880s, but his very presence in the city in the late 19th century marks the beginning of a very long and important history. And it's one that I think that we'll see is unfortunately been under-researched, under-archived, under-recognized, not just in history books, but also importantly in the way in which we understand our physical spaces. Rafael Valles arrives in the 1880s, but of course, he arrives as a single man. That population that he begins in the late 19th century is one that has really blossomed, not just in Milwaukee, but across Wisconsin over the last few decades. And you see here the latest numbers that we have from the US Census, which according to recent reports are actually undercounts. We're probably closer to 500,000 people now in Wisconsin of Latinx descent. In Milwaukee County, the 2020 census marked 153,000 people of Latinx descent. And here in the city of Milwaukee, the population has grown to 116,306 people of Latinx descent. I'll say that number again, 116,306 people of Latinx descent who call the city of Milwaukee home. That's a growth of nearly 13% from the last census in 2010. And Latinos now account for in the city of Milwaukee about a fifth of the population. 20% of our city's population is Latinx. And what's really startling or kind of important to note here is that Latinx people and Asian descent people make up really the only populations in our state that have been growing over the last decade. Here in Milwaukee, our city's Black population dropped by about 6%, and our city's white population dropped by 22%. And so what is important to note here is not only that this long history matters, which I think as a historian it certainly does, but it also matters for the way in which we understand the future of our city and the future of our state. And I think we can talk about this during our discussion today. So as I mentioned, I want to go through a very quick run through the history of Latinx settlement here in Milwaukee. And again, there's no way I can cover everything. If you have questions about something I missed, please feel free to add it in the chat and we'll try to come to it in our conversation. There are large swaths of the history that I just won't be able to hit in our conversation today. Rafael Valles arrives in the 1880s, but he kind of lives here by himself for quite a few decades. It's really not until the 1920s that we begin to see the growth of a large or significant Latinx population here in the city. And that first population that arrives here in Milwaukee in the 1920s is arriving directly from Mexico. In the 1920s, the United States passes a series of immigration laws that dramatically cuts off immigration flows from Europe, specifically from Southern Eastern Europe. Americans are, on the whole, greatly troubled with the rapidly changing demographics of the nation. Many Americans are worried that the people who are arriving from places like Poland and Greece and Italy look different, sound different, they speak a different language, they practice their faith differently. And in order to kind of begin to stem that growth, that change, US Congress basically shuts off immigration from Europe. But by shutting off immigration from Europe, of course, they're also shutting off one of the most important pieces of industrialist opportunity to grow their businesses across the United States. And that, of course, is access to labor. And so within those very same laws that cut off immigration from Europe, Congress leaves a little bit of a backdoor open to Mexico, with no limits placed on the number of people that can really arrive from Latin America. So companies all across the United States begin to turn their attention from Europe down to Mexico to recruit labor, including here in Milwaukee. Companies like the Pfister and Vogel Tannery begin to send labor recruiters down to the central states of Mexico, places like Aguascalientes, Michoacán, and Jalisco, which is my family's home state. And these labor recruiters go down into the central states of Mexico with one very clear purpose, and that is to get young men to sign labor contracts to come up to Wisconsin to work. In Spanish, these labor recruiters are called enganchistas, and enganchar in Spanish means to hook. So these men are literally going down there to hook young men to come up to Milwaukee. Now, Mexico in 1920 has just experienced a very traumatic revolutionary war. The economy in the country is devastated, and there are young Mexican men living in small towns and rural parts of Mexico that are just looking for opportunities, looking for a chance to better themselves and to have a better economic shot for themselves and their families. And so these young Mexican men begin to sign contracts. The Pfister and Vogel Tannery is one of the first companies to reach down to Mexico. So you can imagine that these young Mexican men board trains in the central states of Mexico, and they come up through the Southwest, through the Midwest before they arrive here to the Great Lakes region, and they get off their trains at the train depot in Milwaukee. Now, these young Mexican men were certainly not expecting a parade or a celebration, an invitation, an arrival here in Milwaukee, but they were also not expecting German American, Polish American, Slavic American workers with bats in their hands, ready to bash their heads in. The thing that companies like Pfister and Vogel did not tell these young Mexican men before they signed their labor contracts is that many of the companies here in Milwaukee were engaged in labor disputes with their unionized workforces. And instead of engaging in good faith and collective bargaining with their workers, they just went south to get strikebreakers, to get scabs. And so the first interaction that many Milwaukeeans have with this newly arriving community from Mexico is that these people are coming here to take our jobs. And of course, that is a well-worn line that many of us who pay attention to immigration in 2022 are familiar with, that immigrants are just coming to this country to take away the jobs of well-deserved Americans. And it's one, of course, that was manufactured in the 1920s. It's one that continues to be manufactured today. Now, you might imagine that after such a chilly reception that many of these Mexican workers would have said, forget it, I don't want anything to do with this. I was brought under false pretenses, I'm going back home. But again, remember, the conditions were so bad economically in Mexico, this was the best shot that many Mexicans had here in Wisconsin. And so what initially turned out to be 10, 15, 20, 50 men arriving in Milwaukee eventually grew into a growing group of young, able-bodied men that were working in our city's tanneries, factories, and foundries. And after World War I, Milwaukee was buzzing with industrial energy. These men often worked the dirtiest, the most dangerous, the lowest paying jobs in the city. Places like tanneries, of course, which just working with caustic chemicals smells terrible. And it's just really some of the dirtiest work that you can do. But again, the opportunities here in Milwaukee were much better than anything that they could find back in Mexico. And so many of them stayed. They stayed for their 6-month contract, and they signed another contract after that. And then eventually a small community of Mexican men was growing on our city's south side. And almost all of them settled on the near south side in the same places right down the street from the factories and foundries at which they were working. They didn't do so because they wanted to live on the near south side. They did so because that was the cheapest place to live. And for many of them, that was the only place that they could actually find people who would be willing to rent to them. Eventually, those young Mexican men sent word back home, and they brought with them their families up to Milwaukee. In 1910, there were fewer than 50 Mexicans living in the city of Milwaukee, according to the census. But by the end of the 1920s, that number had grown to over 5,000 people of Mexican descent. And many of them settled, as I mentioned, in the very same places where they lived, which was the near south side, the area that we was referred to back in the 1920s as Grove Street, but that we now know today, of course, as Fifth Street. That area that is referred to as Walker's Point. Walker's Point was the original settling site for these Mexican immigrants. And they were in fact following in the steps of the European immigrants who had preceded them. John Gerda has often referred to Walker's Point as the Ellis Island of Milwaukee, if not the entire state of Wisconsin. It has been the entry point for many immigrants arriving both directly from Europe, but also who come across the United States. And it was the entry point for many Mexican immigrants who arrived in the 1920s as well. So this community begins to grow on the city's south side. They begin renting these places, not owning, because they can't afford to, nor would anybody actually sell to a person of Mexican descent. So they rent apartments in this very same spaces and down the street from the place that they're working. And that community by the end of the 1920s is becoming very permanent, right? They have an actual footprint in the city. And many Milwaukeeans become quite alarmed at the growth of this population. In fact, they begin to question why it was that these people that Congress had promised in the early 1920s would simply be transient workers, guest workers who would come to work for a limited term and then go back down to Mexico, were actually staying in the city. In fact, in the 1920s, Mexicans were often referred to by politicians as birds of passage, right? That they would be just like a seasonal bird that would come up to work and then would fly back down to Mexico when their terms of contract were over. But now by the end of the 1920s, this community is settling in Milwaukee. And many Milwaukeeans came to see these people as being an alien population. In fact, one social worker who produced a report for the YWCA's International Institute referred to these people as an American problem that had to be solved. And this was a discourse that followed all across the United States. It was often referred to as the Mexican problem. This population that was deemed to be linguistically inferior, socially inferior, racially inferior, a problem that had to be solved. And so Mexicans had a real tough time in the 1920s finding spaces in the city, physical locations where they could actually build a sense of community. And like any immigrant group before them that had preceded them, Mexicans did what Germans and Poles and Serbians and Italians had done before them. They looked inward. They turned inward to create community amongst themselves. They did things like make mutual aid societies. This is the Milwaukee's first Mexican mutual aid society, founded in 1929, La Sociedad Mutualista Hispano-Azteca, founded here in the city with transplants from the central states of Mexico. And I just want to take a second to look at this image. I want you to take a look. Not only are the people dressed to the nines, of course, they're in their Sunday best because you're getting a picture taken, but they have three banners that are waving behind them. One, of course, is the standard of the Mutual Aid Society. Over here is the Mexican flag, honoring their Mexican heritage. But over here on the other side is the American flag. And what you see here are people of Mexican descent who have settled in Milwaukee trying to navigate this new space. They're trying to understand their identity within this physical location that has often treated them as something alien, something different. And yet at the same time, they're trying to understand their role as Mexicans, and perhaps as some of them would begin to refer to themselves as Mexican Americans in this city. So they made mutual aid organizations. They founded their own grocery stores, of course, places where they could import things from back home, beans and spices and molcajetes and chocolate, and whatever it is that they needed to remind them of what it meant to be back in Mexico. This is Milwaukee's first Mexican grocery store, founded by Arturo Morales, who had come here as one of those factory workers in the early 1920s. He saved up enough money to open the city's first Mexican grocery store on the 500 block of South 5th Street. And they did things like make their own recreational spaces as well, made their own baseball clubs. This is Los Amigos Baseball Club, taking a picture down there on 5th and National, Walker's Point again. And they would often play against Polish American workers and German American workers from other factories and foundries on the city's sandlots, where they often won. They were pretty good too. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I was going to talk a little bit about religion. They also found ways to build their old religious spaces where they could build a sense of self. This is Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Mission Chapel, which was an old storefront that, with the help of the Catholic Church, Mexicans purchased on 313 Grove Street, which is today 719 5th Street. And that building, which was an old storefront building, they transformed that into a space that reflected their sense of Catholicism, their sense of faith, a place where they could actually practice faith in a way that was familiar to them. That building on 5th Street still exists today. You can see it if you walk down 5th and National. Today, it is a beauty parlor. Doesn't really have any sort of connotations or remembrances of its religious space. This community, which began as a few thousand industrial workers and their families in the 1920s, continued to grow through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And through the 1940s and 50s, a growing Puerto Rican population began to arrive here in Milwaukee as well. That population settled not just in the Walker's Point area, but also on the near east side and the near north side. And this population, as it continued to grow in the 1960s and 1970s, found ways to make space in the city. In 1966, that Mexican and Puerto Rican community that developed on the near south side had outgrown its Catholic Mission Chapel and actually took over the Holy Trinity Church, that same image that I showed you at the beginning. This is a processional of the Mexican and Puerto Rican Catholics on the city's south side walking from their small telephone building to the Holy Trinity Church to kind of take over that church and rename it Holy Trinity Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. In the 1960s, as this community was growing, it also needed physical spaces to serve the community and to have social services for the community. And so the three most important organizations that serve Latinos in Wisconsin today were founded in the 1960s. And I want to walk through them very quickly. All three of them are founded by the city's Catholic and Protestant churches. El Centro Hispano, which was founded in 1963 by the Catholic Church, formed as a response to the city's growing Mexican and Puerto Rican population, and as a way of having specifically educational opportunities for this population in a building on 5th and National Avenue. The United Community Center, founded by Protestant mission groups in 1963, started out in an old dilapidated storefront kind of bar, turned into a place that was known as the Spot. The UCC, as many listeners might know today, it takes up multiple city blocks on the city's south side and is perhaps one of the most important institutions in the state for our Latinx population. Truly a cradle to grave social service agency serving everything from prenatal care all the way to our senior citizens in the city of Milwaukee. And then, of course, an organization that was founded to serve our growing migrant population across the state of Wisconsin, the United Migrant Opportunity Services, or UMOS, founded in 1965, originally in Waukesha, but moving into the 800 block of Greenfield Avenue into a building that had actually been, had lived many lives, but in the 1960s and 1970s served as the foundational space for migrants seeking to relocate from rural parts of Wisconsin into urban spaces like Milwaukee, Waukesha, Racine, and Kenosha. Now, as this Mexican population, Puerto Rican population, Central American population continued to grow in the 1960s and 1970s, these people also began to push back against those very same barriers that their predecessors had faced in settling in the city. Those barriers that often made them feel like they were only workers or only here to do labor, and in fact had no dignity beyond the labor that they could provide their employers. And so the 1960s and 1970s was also a time in which young Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans began to take physical space for themselves at the very time when they were being told that they did not belong in spaces, did not have a home in spaces. Young Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans went into those spaces and took them over for themselves. The most dramatic example, of course, is what happened at UW Milwaukee in 1970. Young Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans formed an organization called the Council for Education of Latin Americans. And this space became an opportunity for Mexicans to demand access to higher education. They took physical space as well in the way in which they protested in physical spaces. This is the 6th Street Viaduct, which separates the near South Side from the downtown area. And here, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans are marching against police brutality and in support of welfare rights in the cold winter of 1971. And then one of my favorite images here is of young Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans going back to those religious spaces, using them as protest spaces as they created their social movements here. This is a protest against police brutality against Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans in the city. There in front, you see a young Tony Baez, who just retired from the Milwaukee Public School Board. And here, of course, you see kind of a mix of individuals using the steps of that same church, Our Lady of Guadalupe, as a meeting space for themselves. So I'm running out of time, so I want to quickly end with a few points for us to think about. And this is I think a really difficult one that I want to engage in conversation with it during our chat. How do we commemorate this history? Much of what I've talked about here is somewhat ephemeral. The history of protests, the history of community organizing is often very hard to find a physical space in, and it becomes even harder to kind of pin to a specific physical location when many of the areas in which these populations moved to in the 20th century have begun to disappear. And of course, I think the most dramatic example of that is Walker's Point, that very same founding location for our city's original Latinx sojourners, people that we refer to as Los Primeros, or the first. Mexican descent workers, when they began arriving in the 1920s, they settled in a part of the city that was often considered as one of the most beat up parts of the city. It was the place where immigrants arrived. It was a place where immigrants often tried to leave, or at least the second generation of immigrants tried to leave when they had the financial resources to do so. But Walker's Point to 2022 continues to be the heart, not just of Latinx Milwaukee, but of Latinx Wisconsin. It's still one of the most densely populated locations for Latinx populations in our state. And it's a location where that has actually been deemed, according to 1978 efforts by the Wisconsin Historical Society, to be a historic place. But of course, the irony is that this entire neighborhood that has been deemed a historic neighborhood by the National Register of Historic Places doesn't have a single location that has been recognized for its Latinx history. So the very space where Latinx people first arrived in the 1920s, none of the locations on the register are actually recognized for the presence of Latinx people. And this problem becomes even more severe when we think about what's been happening to Walker's Point over the last decade, which has been a very rapid and severe case of gentrification. Many of these locations that Latinx people arrived in to work in, to live in, to struggle within, have either been completely ignored, or even worse, have been torn down and have become locations for the development of new apartment complexes and condominiums, very spaces that Mexican descent and Puerto Rican descent people can't afford in this region. I think one of the most stark examples of this, and I don't mean to drop names, but I'll do it here now anyways, is the River Place Lofts in Walker's Point, a place that I toured when I moved back to Milwaukee from Madison, and a place that, a set of apartment buildings that proudly recognizes its history as a former plant for the Pfister and Vogel Tannery, but is a place that absolutely prices out the majority of residents who actually live in Latinx Walker's Point. And so to begin to address this issue, the fact that no location in the city of Milwaukee, much less the state of Wisconsin, has been added to the historic register as a place of Latinx significance for our state. In the spring of 2021, I joined with a set of colleagues at Marquette University to begin to think about this from an academic perspective, specifically from a teaching perspective. In the spring of 2021, my colleagues, Dr. Patrick Mullins and Laura Matthew and I created an independent study opportunity for some of our public history students at Marquette University. We had 3 students who joined us, 3 students of Latinx descent, 2 of them called Milwaukee home before they came to Marquette. And each of them performed over 150 work hours over the semester to begin thinking about this very question. And we made sure to work closely with our SHPO office, with Dr. Dinah Pincutis, to begin to think about how our state historical society, our state historic preservation communities could begin to address this issue. And we had 2 fundamental goals, which for the first one, of course, to begin to actually identify those spaces that deserve to be commemorated, right? Spaces that have been the building locations for our community's social movements, for financial importance, places of labor, places that should be added to the register. And of course, we had to think about this within the context and the specific confines of what historic preservation means within the 50-year marker. And then thinking, of course, about what locations could actually qualify for historic preservation. And I want to just quickly, before I open it for conversation here, leave us with 2 comments from students who participated in this activity, in this Hispanic Milwaukee Preservation Project in the spring of 2021. And it really was an experiment because it's nothing we had ever done before, but it was our first stab at thinking about what historic preservation could mean for Latinx Milwaukee. And a reminder, of course, that the 3 students who participated in this project were all Latinx themselves, and 2 of them were Milwaukee lifers. So the first comment here, I just want to read it aloud from one of our interns. I'd never considered historic preservation as particularly important to my own life, simply because most history isn't based around people that are like me. Despite the fact that I have grown up in the city, surrounded by a Hispanic population, and went to schools with kids who look like me, there wasn't much of a thought on the impact of that population on the community as a whole. I didn't learn about it, and until I became an undergrad in history, I don't think to question it too much. Even up until this semester, I didn't know how much about the history of Latinx communities in Milwaukee other than my own personal experiences. I took this internship because I was more curious about learning about public history and have come out of it much more interested in the history of my home. And I want to think about that question of home because I think it's fundamental to the way in which many of us interact with Milwaukee, right? The reason that many of us are engaged in historic preservation, because we believe strongly in our bones that there is something important to preserve, not just for ourselves, but for future communities that will call these spaces home. And as another student, as part of our internship, noted, the community we live in exists the way it does because organizations like these, like the ones that I've talked about today, exist. These buildings are symbolic of a community that has worked together to create a home in the city despite all attempts to make them believe otherwise. And I think that's the work that we have ahead of us as a community engaged in historic preservation. How do we push back against a system that has fundamentally ignored these populations for decades and that has failed to acknowledge these communities' histories in the same way that I found when I first entered the archives in 2013. It's important to understand that these communities have been under-archived, under-researched, and under-preserved, and for us to think about what that means, not just for the way we appreciate and understand these communities as an integral part of our city and state's history, but what it means for how we understand their sense of belonging and sense of community for the future of our city and for the future of our state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. González. That was fantastic. Yeah, so much important information about the history of, not just history, but the places and great work being done, and really diving into this really important question of, as we understand more about the community, how do we ensure that the economic forces that are operating in the city are, or other forces aren't putting a shadow over these important stories, and that we're able to make sure that they continue to be shared, not just the stories, but the places continue to survive. as well. I would invite anyone at this time to put questions that you might have in the chat. I know we would love to have 10, 15 minutes or so of conversation. So really I encourage folks to put thoughts or questions that you have in the chat, which we can pose then to Dr. González. I would maybe kick us off with a question about the good work that's been done with the Historic Milwaukee Preservation Project. I guess maybe a two-part question: where is that information, the results of that survey, essentially available to the public? Can folks access that, or is there a plan for that to be publicly accessible? And then kind of discussing next step. Is there a set next step to work on National Register designations or editing existing designations, a context statement or a multiple property designation, or kind of what are the next steps?
That's a great question, Jeremy. So I'll start with this, that that opportunity was an experiment, and it's one that we did in the middle of a pandemic, one that we ran completely virtually. We had grand aspirations to do kind of community-based presentation and to work with community partners. And unfortunately, we were not able to hit all of the marks that we wanted. Our students created ultimately kind of an annotated bibliography, looking at a few different sites. They identified a few sites that would currently fit within the historic register under the 50-year limit, and then another site that would potentially one day fit into that, right? So they talked about the original UMOS building over on Greenfield, which is actually already unfortunately on the historic register. But again, this is something that we're seeing, I think, in this history, in that a lot of the places that Latinx people moved into were places that they repurposed. And so they were already historical places, but oftentimes the history of their settlement in those places and use of those places is not recognized either historic register or in our public memory of them. And so those results aren't public. Our goal is to run another course of this once we're on the other side of the pandemic, or at least kind of, more more able to engage in public conversations about this. I'm on sabbatical for next year, so it's something that'll have to wait until I come back for my time off. But I think there is a growing sense of appreciation for this among historians across the state, and specifically here in Milwaukee. And we have institutions here in Milwaukee, Alverno, UWM, Carthage, Marquette, that are working towards becoming Hispanic serving institutions, which means we have more students that I think are going to be in campus spaces. They're going to be willing to do this work. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity to engage in those conversations moving forward.
Great, thank you. And yeah, looking at some questions that are coming in here. We'll start with a question from Jessica. And just scrolled up. There we go. After your findings or not at the Historical Society, what other resources on the Latinx history in Milwaukee did you find?
It's a great question. It took me 6 years to do the master's and the PhD, and so within that frame, I was able to find quite a few more resources. Fortunately, oftentimes I was having to work against the way in which these communities were archived, right? So oftentimes their presence wasn't actually explicitly written into archives, and whether that was state records or local records of social service organizations or state organizations. So looking at the way in which labor records of migrant farm workers. Unfortunately, many of the institutions' records of the groups that I've talked about have not been well preserved. And so one of the ways in which I've kind of worked around that is doing oral history interviews. And then working with those individuals in the community who are fundamental storytellers and public historians to try to begin to recover those histories. It's an exciting time to be engaged in this work because last year I was able to join with a group of colleagues from the state of Wisconsin who want to rectify the situation. We found an organization called the Wisconsin Latinx History Collective, and we're public historians and academic historians all across the state. We're beginning to recover the archives, but also to engage in this oral history work. And we're working with the Wisconsin Historical Society to make sure that there's a permanent home for them, not just in physical space, but also digital space, so that as many people in our state can have access to those resources.
Great, excellent, an important comment here, I think, as well, that I want to repeat. A comment that we can further build community by engaging the Latino community in a leadership role in moving forward. I think obviously too often, I think it's we have situations where where the white or dominant community is either ignoring or inviting the Latino community to participate in our space. And I think an important kind of point here about really centering the Latino voice and making sure that the community themselves is leading these efforts. Yeah, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
No, and I think that kind of builds. I think that's Luis's point that builds off of Nora's point that follows there, which is this idea of how our communities actually be engaged in this process. And I think anyone who's on this call and knows about historic preservation knows that unfortunately there's a steep learning curve to learn about the process of adding a physical space to the historic register. And then, of course, there's money attached to it, right? Having to actually prepare the report. Oftentimes, you're hiring an outside consultant. And then there's just learning the different rules to actually get it from the starting line to the finish and actually getting added to the state historic register. And so I think, unfortunately, one of the barriers that we face as multiple communities, Latinx communities in our state, are information barriers and having access points to begin to actually have these conversations. And so I'm heartened because we have a great staff at the SHPO office, the State Historic Preservation Office in Madison, individuals who are really committed to this type of work. I think there's still a lot of work that we have to do to make sure that there are conversations happening between our state officials and the individuals who know how to do this work and the communities that know this history really well. And so to Norma's point, I think more work has to be done in this vein to make sure that all people are in the room for these conversations.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that touches on another question that came in. Is the Latinx community as a whole invited to participate in this initiative, or the more reflective exercise? And I think it sounds like we're saying that yes, but we need to do better in making sure that everyone's a part of, or the Latinx community is a part of the conversation. I have another good question that came in here about if you have any thoughts on how to commemorate properties that might not fit within the National Register frameworks for listing, but are still important to the community. As we know, maybe places where maybe integrity has not been kept up. Buildings may not necessarily look the way that they did years ago, and so maybe there are challenges with the National Register system for listing. But there are other ways to commemorate places. Are there ideas or thoughts on ways to do that outside of the register?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer this in two parts. I mean, what the answer is, of course, right? If we can raise enough money, we can talk about establishing placards and kind of historical markers that could be great educational opportunities. Have these bilingual, and to Margaret's point in the chat there, right? It could be added to a walking tour so that these spaces can be commemorated. But I think, Jeremy, your point about the qualifications that a building has to meet is also an important barrier, and it's one that sometimes can be somewhat, I don't want to use the term discriminatory, but it certainly leaves out a lot of different spaces that perhaps by the markers of state and national register do not have the full fulfillment of of a historic place, that it's been altered too much or what have you. And when an individual and a property owner or a community then can't access that historic register, that means that they also can access resources, right? So we know that there are two major reasons that a building gets added to the register. It's not just for historic preservation, it's also access to tax benefits. And so I think one of the conversations we need to have is the equity that's kind of attached to this conversation here, right? What does it mean when there are no Latinx designated spots on the state and historic register? That means that there are no locations that then can qualify for those tax benefits. And so I think we need to have a conversation about alternatives, but also thinking about how these can be barriers for communities as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and yes, yeah, and then it's a conversation that's happening in the broader preservation community as well, kind of questioning the the necessity of things like the integrity standards in the National Register. Now we have also a local historic designation in the city as well. And just to, I guess, a plug to anybody for our local designation here in Milwaukee, any resident of the city can submit a nomination for any building in the city for local historic designation, which doesn't on the face of it offer tax credits, though it does make it significantly easier to access the state historic tax credits. And that again is a different barrier to entry than the National Register. That form is not quite as exhaustive as the National Register, and so but again, and an additional benefit of local designation, and it does come with protections against well, it comes with the public process, I guess we'd say, that before any changes would be able to be made to a locally designated building on the exterior, including demolition. It would need to go through a public process through the city. So potentially, opportunities there. So I guess just encourage folks, if there are places that are significant to you in the community, there's information on the city's Historic Preservation Commission website, and we are of course also a resource on this process, and happy to help and walk people through that process. But opportunities to nominate places for local historic designation as well. And again, a great comment here as well by Susan about the intangible heritage that's represented here. I think this is something that in preservation, as we're thinking about, the field has so often been focused on buildings, and buildings are important for many reasons. Perhaps the most important because of the stories and the cultures that have taken place there, because they matter to people, because of the memory of what has happened there. And so how do we preserve that intangible heritage? Or again, and if places do not exist anymore, as is often the case. So that's that was maybe too long.
I mean, Susan makes a great point, which is that there's a balancing act here in how much to invest in the physical preservation of space. And I'm reminded of, I don't know, I'm sure many people saw this article that came out a few weeks ago in the Atlantic from Jacob Enbender, which was kind of a provocative piece about the social justice issue tied to historic preservation, right? Which is, I think most of us who engage in this work have a really clear-eyed understanding of what we want to do, which is to preserve these spaces because they tell important stories about our past. But there can also then be barriers to the way in which the communities that inhabit these spaces can no longer live within those spaces, right? And is physical space the only way in which you can commemorate this history? Well, of course not, right? Especially for communities that have been under-archived. And if we focus too much on the preservation of physical space, we can perhaps miss so many different histories. That's why, while I serve on the State Historic Preservation Review Board, and I take that work seriously, I'm also an oral historian. And I think there's so much that can be gained in that kind of cultural memory that doesn't have to have a physical location, right? And in fact, in a digital world, sometimes people can access these histories in so many different ways that doesn't have to actually be in that physical spot.
Great. And I want to get to these two. We have two more questions I see in the chat, and appreciate all of these great questions from everyone. Jessica is asking about if we found any ties to the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago. History seems very similar to Walker's Point, and also on the National Register.
Yeah, I mean, Pilsen has a beautiful history of Mexican settlement going back to the late 1910s and early 1920s. So it's a very similar history to what happens here in Milwaukee, right? Many people arriving from Mexico in search of industrial labor for the exact same reasons that people arrive here in Walker's Point. And Pilsen, of course, is a neighborhood that is going through similar transformations right now to what's happening in Walker's Point. Kind of these very hyper-local fights over public space and private space, and what a community is commemorated for, who has access to city streets and to buildings. And so there are certainly parallels there. This question of kind of ethnic secession within these church spaces as well. My colleague Deb Cantor wrote a beautiful book called Making Mexican Chicago, which is the history of Catholic churches in places like Pilsen, and how Mexican and Puerto Rican communities have kind of become the largest populations within those church spaces. And so it's a great point from Jessica.
Thank you. And then the last question that I'm seeing in the chat here is from Elizabeth, asking about the church archives and the possibility that they, obviously Our Lady of Guadalupe being a especially significant piece of the history here in Milwaukee. But do those church archives have an ability to maybe fill in some of that picture in Wisconsin a little more?
Yeah, I love our archivists at the Milwaukee Catholic Archdiocese. They are fantastic archivists, but I've been working with them now since 2013, and there certainly are some archives that have been preserved, but they'll also tell you that not enough has been saved about these communities, right? So my master's dissertation works off of a set of archives from the Catholic Archdiocese here at St. Francis, which tells the history of that initial Mexican mission chapel from the 1920s and its development. And we have a set of letters that were preserved that kind of tell the history in the late 1920s about the creation of that physical space. But there's a lot that's missing within those archives. And so, unfortunately, sometimes you get lucky and you find stacks of paper that have been hidden somewhere, but more often than not, that paper trail is gone. So then we have to kind of do, we have to read the silences in different ways and find different ways to tell these stories. Oral history sometimes can help us in that. But we just have to be creative in how we can find those histories.
Yeah, so save everything as part of the model going forward. Yeah. This has been really fantastic, and Dr. González, you can see we have lots of accolades in the chat that I would echo strongly. I think everybody, if you can join me, please, in offering our really sincere thanks to Dr. Sergio González for not only for this presentation, but for the really important work that you've done to document this history, the work that you're continuing to do with students, and again for the work that's coming up on the horizon. And I'm sure your sabbatical will be productive. We'll look forward to getting you back to dive back into some of this work. So please everybody join me in thanking Dr. González for his time and for his work. This has been a really fantastic presentation. And again, as I said at the beginning, this conversation is not the beginning of the conversation. It is certainly not the end of the conversation. This work has been happening, and it will continue to happen. And we are very proud to have been to be able to be a small part of this, and would invite anyone listening here. Again, we are our role in preservation here is really to be an advocate, help the public understand how preservation works, how it can benefit communities. And so if encourage you to reach out to us, MPA at MilwaukeePreservation.org anytime. And then we are very happy to continue to engage in these conversations and hope that this is a step, again, in moving the organization and preservation in Milwaukee towards something that's really inclusive. And so I hope that we can continue this conversation going forward. And again, encourage everyone, if you enjoyed the presentation tonight, please do check out the rest of what we're doing, sign up for our email list, and of course, feel free to support our work so that we can continue to bring these types of programs and advocacy to everyone. So with that, I will wish everyone a fantastic night, and encourage you to continue to go out into the world and tell us about the places that are important to you, and work to make sure that that those stories are preserved, and that they are and the places are preserved as well. So thank you so much to everyone for this evening.
Thank you.